Hey, this is Sky. Welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I just want to talk about a little writing exercise you can do, and you'll learn a lot about yourself. It's to write your autobiography. I did this. I did it really just to write my autobiography so I could get it published and maybe made into a movie. But it was one of the most profound experiences that I've really had in my personal development and my growth as an adult. It really was interesting to do it as a process, but then also to read it back, to edit it. The whole experience of turning my story into a book, my life into a book, and trying to make it a good story, a story worth reading, was really a powerful experience, and it taught me a lot about myself. It taught me a lot about my fantasies that I may have had about my childhood, both nostalgia and sometimes we look at our past through different lenses, depending on our mood, depending on the conversation, on who we're talking to. If we're talking to one of our buddies or if we're talking to our grandma, we could have a different image in our head about what our childhood was. But then when you write it as a book for everyone, for the mass market. Now, let me say this. You're not going to do this exercise with the intention of letting anybody read it. This is purely for you. But you write it as if others would read it. Now, that's up to you. If you get done with this and you feel like, hey, this is awesome and I'm going to, get famous, good for you. But the point of it is really just a therapy, an exercise to learn about yourself. The process of writing it really was interesting because I found myself at first having a hard time figuring out where to start, because none of us really, maybe you have a better memory than me, but most people don't remember their birth. They don't remember being a baby in a crib. So they start their life story somewhere around a powerful event in their childhood. So that, it took me a minute to figure out where to start and what to add in and what to delete. And that's where it really got interesting. Was when I initially first wrote the book, I thought there was certain aspects of my life, certain events, particularly some of the traumatic events. And I thought that they would be really amazing tidbits in the story, driving points of the story. And if you think of a story with a rise and a fall, and how most stories go, you've seen movies, you've read books, they're usually centered around certain events. Well, it turned out that some of these things that had happened to me that I thought were book-worthy really weren't. And I ended up deleting them, not because I was embarrassed about them or ashamed of letting people know some of these things that happened to me and how horrible some aspects of my life had been. I'm pretty humble. I don't really mind letting people know what I went through. Maybe somebody can learn from it. But I realized that it just really didn't matter to the story as much. My intention with writing it was to make it a good story, to make it a story worth reading. Now, you may not have had a life that is worth anything. You may be sitting here listening to this thinking, well, Sky, haven't had a life that is worth writing about. It doesn't matter. You're not going to show this to anybody. It's just an exercise. But I guarantee you that you'll find that your life is more interesting than you thought, and you're a more interesting person than you thought. And you may find, like I thought, that some of the things that you had felt were the most interesting parts of you really weren't, and may not even be worth putting in the book. Some of the things that I thought for the longest time were the most valuable aspects of me all of a sudden turned out not to be even in the book at all, not even in my life story. So if someone didn't know me and they read my autobiography, they wouldn't even know those events. They would have no knowledge of it. And this whole time I thought that was the most important thing. I was going around kind of like wearing this on my sleeve and like scars on my body, thinking that, well, this is what makes me. Turns out it wasn't even really worth it. Now, it doesn't mean that those experiences weren't powerful, that they weren't traumatic, that they're any less of experiences in my life or who I am. That just means that those didn't make it into the autobiography because I felt like it wasn't working for the story. It wasn't making the story any better. It wasn't moving the story along quicker. It was just something that happened. And it really took some of the weight of those experiences off of my shoulders. Where I realized, yeah, shit happens. Bad things happen to everybody. Good things happen to everybody. I've had good and bad things happen to me, and it really helped me shift because I had always looked at the bad things. I have so many. You give me a bucket, two bowls, and start writing good things and bad things, I could fill the bad thing bucket instantly. Have a couple good things in there. And this is how I always looked at myself. Be like 3,000 bad things and then maybe 2 or 3 good things. After doing this autobiography exercise, I realized I had a lot more good things about me. It was an empowering experience. I wasn't as fucked up as I thought I was. How great is that? It also taught me a lot about my parents because I wrote about my parents. I have interesting parents in some ways. Not that they're amazingly successful or anything like that, but they have their own quirky little stories. And when I started writing little sections about who my mom was and who my dad was and things like that, different people in my family, it helped me see them in kind of a more realistic way, that they're just people. A lot of us can put our parents on a pedestal. I want to say idolize, some people do, but when you say idolize, you get this image of somehow like you're worshiping your parents, because not all of us do. Not all of us worship our parents. Some people, as children, recognize the deep flaws that their parents have. I recognized my dad was an alcoholic who beat my mother. That was obvious in my house, so I wasn't looking up to that behavior. But nonetheless, even if my dad was flawed and my mom was weak, I still had these certain images of both of them in my head growing up, just as a child and as a man, as a young adult. And then I did this exercise, and I'm writing about them. I'm describing them for the first time to people that might never even have met them. They have no idea who my mother and my father is, and I have to describe them as best as I can. And reading those descriptions back was really amazing. And then having to edit it, well, that's not really important to put in there, or that kind of sounds like I'm bad-mouthing them, so let me take that out, because I don't want to be judgmental on this description. I just want to give the reader a clear idea of who this person is. I don't want to sound like a brat. So I would go through with these kinds of things in my head as I would edit through those sections and realize, wow, I really wasn't seeing my parents for people, for who they were, like as if they were part of my circle of friends. You see your friends much differently than you see your parents, just as people. A lot of we have these weird images of our parents of being certain ways, but that's only because we can't relate to them because of the generation gap and how little parents usually let children in on their personal lives. You may think you know your dad, but you don't know your dad like your mom knows your dad. Are you kidding me? She knows that guy in a whole different way than you know him. Trust me. I mean, not only just sexually, obviously, but on a personal level. She knows the real him. You don't. You know the parent. You know what he lets you see, what he wants you to see, or what he fails to hide, but you don't know the real person. That's the way it is for most of us. When you do these writing exercises, and when I was writing about my parents, it just kind of lightened the load a little bit. I was able to forgive both of them for their flaws in a way, and just realize, these are just people. They're just characters in a book. So there's many, many different, really powerful lessons that you can learn doing this exercise, and I suggest that you do it. I wrote my book pretty long. I've had a pretty crazy life. It doesn't have to be long for you, You might be able to write your whole autobiography and have it be, 15, 20,000 words, something like that. that would be a short book, but it's, like I said, this is not for publishing unless you want it to be. This is just as an exercise, and you're not going to show this to people, so you don't have to be worried about what you put in there. But like I said, with the editing, with the self-editing of certain scenes, like I did, I realized that some of the stuff that I was worried about putting in there, and I thought, well, geez, this is a really crazy story that happened to me. This might really disturb some people if I write about this. This is really an emotional time. I don't know if I want to go through this again. I realized that those really weren't essential to the story. I could still have a great story without those. So what some people do, just staying on this thread with the self-editing, is they go and write everything in. They do their first draft. They'll do 2 drafts with this. And they write everything in it. The hard stuff, the painful stuff. You could be writing and crying, sobbing, reliving past traumas. Write it all in there. And then on the second pass, the editing pass, your second draft, you take all the stuff out that you don't want people to know, the stuff that you don't think is necessary for the story, the stuff that holds the story back, any weird tangents that draw your timeline, because you want your timeline to move forward, like in any story. Anything that draws it off, you feel like, well, just get rid of that. It's not even necessary to the story. And we all know what that's like. Go ask your grandfather about something and he'll start talking about something completely else, and it's like herding cats. You have to bring him in. No, Grandpa, let's talk about this. You don't want to sit there for 3 hours listening to bullshit. So don't do that in your book either. You may be tempted to when telling your life story. Some of these, like I said, some of these things that you may think are important in the timeline are just tangents that shouldn't even be in the book. That can all be done on your second pass if you want to do 2 drafts. And then you take it out on your second draft. And then you create a second file. And everything that you delete from that second draft, all the stuff that you didn't like, that you didn't want in there, you put that in a third file. You put that in a different file. And that's everything that you didn't want in your story. And then now you have a body of work that's your autobiography. That's your story. That's who you are. That's who you're choosing to be. And then you have this junk file of the stuff that really doesn't matter. And why doesn't it matter? Because it didn't make it in the book. It's not essential to the story. It's just extra stuff that's happened. And then you take that extra file and you delete it. You throw it in your trash can, in your computer. You delete it off your computer and you get rid of it. And that is kind of a cleansing. Of course, all that shit still happened. But it just kind of gives you a release, and you realize, wow, that's gone. It's not in the computer anymore. You wrote it. There's an exercise you can do when you're having emotional traumas. It's called writing and burning. And you can also write and tear. And you can write, people will furiously write some kind of emotional experience that they had. They'll write it out, and then they'll burn it or tear it up. And it's just kind of a way of cleansing. This is kind of the same thing, but with your computer. It's just an added benefit of writing your autobiography, and you really see just who you are and what's important about you, and to be able to present the best you, not just to the world, to give the world the best impression, because first impressions are everything in some experiences, like business and schooling in some scenarios, and relationships many times. First impressions are important, but the impression you have of yourself will change, and that's the whole point. That's the key. That's what we're talking about. So this is just an idea for people that like to write. It's something that I'm really, really glad that I did. Like I said, I wrote my autobiography with the hopes of maybe getting it published, but even if it never goes anywhere, I am so glad I undertook this journey, and I suggest it for everybody. I think everybody should do it. You'll learn about yourself. So thanks for watching. Start writing.